we're going to start off the workshop before we get into specific modifications with a general discussion about what to do with the historical modifications that have been proposed by members of the community over the past few years. So as an example of what those modifications look like, here's the modification suggested by Alessandra in her paper that was just published. And as you can see, it has to do with historical data points. And so the reason that we want to discuss what to do about these modifications is that a lot of people in our community might not have the basis of knowledge required about a specific historical case study to provide a solid opinion on whether we should accept or reject. But at the same time, if we are to just automatically accept, that's not that's not what we're supposed to do according to our workflow. And of course, it leaves the door open for maybe a problematic data point or two to squeak through. So we want to figure out what we should do about these modifications and if a modification to the workflow would be a good idea in the case of dealing with historical modifications. And so we want to discuss now what people think. And then if any specific modifications are suggested, we'll write them down and have a vote on them tomorrow or later in the week. So the floor is open. What do you think we should do about historical modifications? I mean, I have my own opinion I'm happy to share, but I want there to be dialogue.
I think this is a really challenging issue, and I don't know that I have especially strong opinions, but one thing that I think we should be bearing in mind is kind of what the stakes are with the data points. Like, so what are the costs of error if we turn out to be wrong on them? And the reason for that is that the kind of ready acceptance of historical data that we give, there's higher risk of error, but then also we populate things a little bit more, so we have a little bit more of speed issue. Or more of a speed advantage. And if it turns out that these data points, like if we're just populating things with bad data, and this turns out to be really, really difficult to kind of overturn, especially when we're looking towards the database, then I think we ought to go for a little bit more of a cautious approach, whatever that may be. If it's the kind of thing that we can accept these kind of historical data points and revising them, we're able in the future to come up with ways of revising them to make them reliable and accurate and all these sorts of things without too much fuss, then it doesn't seem like the stakes are especially high, and it'd be totally okay to just kind of accept them for now and at least kind of have some data points there that we can work with. So that doesn't point one way or the other, but I think it maybe like helps frame the issue a little bit.
So if I'm understanding, the issue is what to do if we're not sure that we have all the necessary sort of expertise to know if we're being accurate or not, right? That's the issue. Okay.
Maybe, Cameron, maybe to provide slightly more context here. So we've had over the years accumulated a number of historical modifications. So specifically, you see there a couple of them are, a few of them from 2017. This is from mostly a Loisel paper on the authority delegation relations in art market. So it seems that when it comes to this sort of modifications that we don't, as a community or even individual, we don't feel that we have the expertise above and beyond the expertise of the authors and the editors that worked on it and reviewers to give any evaluation to those data points.
Right.
And so that resulted in the absence of any comments on these modifications. I doubt any of these have any comments, but there might be one or two here and there. But overall, there doesn't seem to be critical mass of engagement with these modifications, which just highlights a problem, right? In a small community like this, and even if it becomes a large community, there's always going to be a niche, a very niche subjects where, let's say, Easy wrote a paper on the history of alchemy and chemistry, and of course, it seems like Easy is the best expert on that in this community, and there might be maybe another 4 or 5 people in the whole world that are capable of judging whether that data is good data or not. And so we need to have some kind of a protocol in place, what to do with these modifications. Are we happy to continue evaluating them within the standard Scientonomic workflow, or should we somehow modify the workflow to accommodate for this?
Right. So what I was going to bring up was maybe at least where we can, consulting with relevant historical experts within the field. So, like for instance, when I was doing some work with like Lysenkoism, I'm not an expert on that. Sure, I've read a bunch on it, but I'm not an expert. But there are people who are experts in it. Professor Krementsov, for instance, find someone who is an expert on it and see if at least we haven't made any major blunders, like proofreading from a relevant expert with some degree of delegation.
Jamie, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, thank you, Izzy, and thank you, Cameron. I think just for a little bit of background, Hakab and I have kind of informally talked about this a little bit, and I was kind of thinking along very similar lines. One worry, legitimate worry, I think Hakab brought up has to do with like kind of how that would look, but I don't want to stifle creativity on trying to figure that out. So on the one hand, we have a technical vocabulary for how we explain things, and we don't. I don't think it's always going to be realistic to expect experts in the field who, if we like kind of cold call, say like, did they accept this proposition at this time? Like they might not really know what it means to accept in our sense, right? And then you would have to kind of train them a little bit, and you have to expect a decent amount of their attention. And while you might get people who are very generous with their time and might sit through with us on that, that might not be a super reliable mechanism, but also I guess at the end of the day, we don't know. We haven't really tried it. One other thought that occurred to me when you mentioned the example of Lysenkoism in your own case, I don't want to say that like I'm in favor of this position, but I just kind of want to put it out there. Is one thing we could do is we could be a little bit more restrictive in terms of the historical case studies that we cover, where we cover them with people who we know we like external experts who we could validate at the other end kind of thing. So it's kind of like we know we have somebody on call who we can run things by on that topic, and that kind of depends on the backlog of historians that we kind of have at our disposal. But obviously that brings up the disadvantage that like we as supervisors and instructors want projects, we want people to have fun with them, and we want them to do things that are really interesting to them and maybe line up with other research interests that they have. And that's part of why we've had the flexibility that we've had so far. So there's costs and benefits of kind of going that way.
So looking at some of these, for example, the Wildenstein, the one about the art market community, we really need that to be reviewed by art historians. And it seems to me we can explain to them, we're the experts in Scientonomy, and we can explain to them what they need to know in order to apply their subject area expertise to it. So I don't think there's Jamie's concern that they might not be willing to give their time is a good one, but I don't see what else we can do except have subject matter experts, ideally Newman and Principi for the one on alchemy, and an art historian for the one on the Monet delegation and the Wildenstein Institute. And I don't think we can do without subject area expertise.
So yeah, I think that Cameron observation, it's what we must do, while James' observation response actually is what we can do. I think that they are in different dimensions. And I agree with Cameron that because the risk of just doing what we can do and not pushing harder of what we must do can make us more restricted and more self-centered, which is a risk for the quality of epistemic information that we're gonna have. So yeah, I know it is hard to ask people to give their time to us, but I think this is something that we need to do, although it's not an easy thing to do. I think this is the challenge that Jamie proposed. It is true. It's hard to get people to read stuff and give their time, but at the same time, it is something that we must do, I think.
I agree. I personally, Paul and I tried to reach out to Bill Newman, and we asked him if he had other people he would recommend we go to, other like anything, any specific data, or specific data. And he did not really seem to understand what we were asking, and he directed us to some of his other work, which we had already read. So I find that the scientonomic language can be a barrier in itself, even before like experts read our papers. If we say like we are looking for when this theory was accepted, they might have a different, like a historiographical kind of perspective on what that means and not understand what we're asking. And I also just think that being respectful of people's time, limited time to read and offer substantial, in some cases, revision is important. So I think if we are to go forward with trying to involve historians of science more broadly with our observational case studies, we would want to have some kind of incentive there, like maybe a third author spot or more acknowledgement in the paper or on the wiki or something, because it is a lot of investment even to understand what we're asking them to do.
Yeah, I think those are excellent points, Izzy. And thanks for sharing your experience. It's not too surprising that scientonomic language can be a bit of a barrier. There might also be, I mean, this is all speculative too. I mean, one thing we can also agree on is to think about doing things experimentally, see how they turn out, and then maybe revisit this in the future. We don't need to totally rely on instinct here. But my thought is my thought is that there also might be disciplinary kind of differences with these things. Like historians can be, they use language in kind of a little bit more of a fuzzy way than we do in philosophy, let alone in Scientonomy. So like I mean I remember talking with a historian of kind of like 1920s development in general relativity, and he refused to call it a theory. Even though what he was saying, it was exactly a theory, but it just couldn't get him to like kind of talk about it in those kinds of terms. And I don't know, it's hard to know how much this kind of experience generalizes, but there might be certain obstacles that make even just an email exchange kind of not the easy check that we might want it to be. Another idea that we could just put out there is one thing that we are lucky about at U of T is that we have a very decently sized pile of historians who are very, very, very good. And you know, we don't need to restrict topics to those kind of things, but they also have networks that we can ask. You know, it's easier to ask our friends and colleagues for help than it is to ask strangers. So, you know, if we're doing something on, say, like, you know, history of psychiatry in the 20th century or something like that, like, you know, we can talk to Marga. But if Marga is not an expert, she probably knows somebody who is, and maybe she's willing to send an email on our behalf. I mean, people might be a little bit more willing to engage in a bit of an email back and forth when they're getting a request from somebody they know. So that's just an idea.
I don't mean to throw a wrench in this conversation, but sort of looking at it in the opposite way, if we don't delegate to a historian, let's say we're proposing a modification and it's a historical episode that's really thoroughly researched, we have a lot of data to support whatever modification we would like to make. Do we treat all historical episodes the same, or is it more imperative to do these kinds of checks for, let's say, a less researched, less known historical episode versus something that's really well covered?
I think Jakob has a comment.
It just so happens that I don't have a raise hand button because I'm the one who started the Zoom session. So there's few additional considerations to keep in mind. The first is we're already having a very hard time finding reviewers for these historical papers when they are submitted for publication. So far, we've been lucky to be able to find at least one for each one of these historical papers. So in a sense, before this data is published, this is being reviewed by the expert historian in the field, but it really takes a long time to secure the the services of even one. And so the idea of trying to find more, yeah, of course, let's try, but it's very difficult. So the question is, what do you do if you don't? Another thing to keep in mind, soon we expect a very healthy or maybe unhealthy amount of new historical data pouring into our tables just because of the new ways we are going to do that through AI and let's say using the system that Grace suggested in the paper published last year, using big data approaches or corpus linguistics or AI, whichever way we're going to do that. So there needs to be some way of speeding up these things. If we are going to build a database, even with an imperfect data, there must be a way of speeding this up. If we are going to say, no data point is being entered into a database unless it's checked by a professional historian, we might be there for a couple of centuries waiting for that to happen. Given all the problems that have been already indicated, very often it takes forever to explain our language. So the language becomes a big barrier. And there are many historians who are not sympathetic to these sort of projects, and that needs to be also taken into account. Very often once they hear that, they say they're allergic to any kind of. And we've heard about this from our colleagues in the database of religious history. You remember they were sharing last year at the conference, and also Seshat. Remember what Peter Francois was saying, right? Very often the main criticism that they hear from historians once they go to them, and they are trying to actively engage historians to verify the data that they somehow gathered, let's say that undergraduate students gathered or graduate students, so they're trying to find expert historians and even pay them as part of the grant project. But very often these historians are not sympathetic by saying, what, are you reducing my lifetime of work to one data point, which sort of makes sense, right? You can sort of understand that sentiment. So we are going to face, and we are already facing similar issues. So therefore, we need some kind of a different way of populating whatever database we are going to have with data, and yet have a way of indicating that, let's say, this data has been verified by this type of expert and this data has not been verified, or some kind of a system like that, similar to what they have in the DRH, Database of Religious History. They have that tier thing, and Seshat has a similar thing as well, like who verified this, whose data this is, and how was this checked. Maybe that kind of an approach might be a better way of doing it. There's a few other ideas I'll throw out there. We just want to hear what people say.
I share the concerns that you have been voicing when consulting historians. I can say from my own experience that they are usually very helpful in answering questions, but I see the point that you are making with the difficulty of explaining scientonomic language to them. But I think that what we really need is to verify some historical facts and so on. So maybe rather than reviewing a scientonomic paper itself, we can just pose questions, not necessarily using the scientonomic language. Like we just need them to check the historical facts without going into explaining scientonomy to them and so on, because I think it will also save time. But this is actually the first time that I participate in this workshop. So how have these things been dealt with in the past when it comes to checking historical facts and so on? I mean,
so historical modifications, we never discussed them. So not a single historical modification has ever been discussed.
But what about previous papers like?
Those we find reviewers, hopefully experts in that area. Let's say with Loisel paper, we were lucky enough to find an art historian who was specializing roughly in that time period. So they were generous enough with their time, so that worked nicely. So similarly with other papers, we find. But in terms of when you say fact-checking, but even for fact-checking, how do you ask them to check, let's say, a claim that X was accepted or became accepted around this time, if before you explain to them what the difference between acceptance, use, and pursuit is? Because what we mean by acceptance is a special term, right? It's different from pursuit. And unless historians understand that these are different stances, You are
Yeah.
going to have always this incommensurability. So how good will that check be?
Yeah, and they tend to be skeptical of the use of some terms. I told you that even in the dissertation defense, when I use this term indicators in a loose way, because we still don't have a precise definition, they were asking, what do you mean by indicator and so on. So yeah, that can be a problem. But what I mean is that checking the basic historiography and so on and the sources, I don't know, that probably can be done in a more neutral way, and rather than expecting them to get familiar with scientonomic language and so on.
I kind of want to toss out that I like Packup's suggestion about like maybe once it comes to actually having the database itself, we have some sort of visual marker that allows us to kind of suggest what the reliability of that data is, or maybe, I mean, there's different ways we could do it. One, we could have like kind of a green, yellow, red, like we have minimal evidence, we have some evidence, or we could do it like this one was validated in this way by this person. Like, I mean, there's different ways we could do that, but that does seem one way of kind of hedging our bets in terms of the reliability of data. So that's nice. I also like Leticia's point, the implied point that like maybe we don't need to treat all historical claims the same, right? Like there are some that are going to be controversial, and some that are going to be in niche topics or historical areas that we just don't know, that we don't have members of the community who know. But then there's also going to be some case studies which are just so well trodden. We can probably safely say, things like Boltzmann pursued atomism between roughly 1840 to roughly 1870. Like nobody is going to doubt that. I can't imagine. And so maybe there's, certain historical claims that we don't have to worry about this with. And that's maybe something we can check ourselves because presumably the authors of the paper have read enough secondary material to say like, okay, there seems to be a consensus on this, or like the data was super easy and straightforward to find. Like, I mean, maybe there are some internal checks that mean we don't have to like get external validation for every single historical modification that we have.
I don't agree with the idea that we need to go each historical case by historical case. So I know that we want to be faster than we are doing, but I think that it is part of philosophy and science being slow. Still after 2,500 years, we're still studying Aristotle's and Plato's work. Not that I'm saying that we're gonna still doing scientonomy for 2,000 years, but maybe, but what I want is to do it in the most qualitative way. And if it means go slow, I think that just it is part of knowledge construction.
So just going off of that and also going back to what Jamie said, I do think there are two different sort of two different things at stake when we do observational scientonomy and have these historical modifications. On the one hand, so far, a lot of it seems to have been based on secondary sources. So a lot of observational scientonomy papers have not been actually looking at the primary sources and doing history in the way that traditional, like professional historians of science do. And that's fine, I think, because one task of observational scientonomy is really to look at those well-trodden histories and sort of scientonomize that. And that's also how we make our theoretical scientonomy papers. So I think that for those ones where it is something like Newtonian physics or whatever, where it's very well trodden and there is consensus outside of the scientonomy community, and we just sort of scientonomize that, I feel like those modifications we can assess within our community, because the question there isn't what happened in the history. It's more of, okay, how do we as scientonomers sort of interpret that? So I think that can be internal. The more complicated one, which is where I think we will need historical experts from outside the community, is in cases where there are scientonomers doing like proper history of science. So I think the paper on dark matter
I think like Castino's one, I think that was one of the only ones so far that was proper primary source observational Scientonomy. So for that, we would want to send it to someone like Helga Krah or some proper historian of physics. But the ones that we've seen the most of so far, which are generally based on secondary sources, I think we can, as a community, sort of look at that internally.
Yeah, it seems I tend to agree with that, but we also have mixed cases. Like a case of alchemy paper seems to be a mixed one. So it started as a sort of more or less safe paper that just look at Newman and Principi, the major figures in the history of alchemy, historians of alchemy. But then immediately it became obvious that you have to probably go and look at the primary sources there because it wasn't clear. It was really fuzzy the way they were formulating things. So, and only after Easy Hall went into the actual primary sources, then so the data is not really fully from the secondary sources. So what do we do in those situations? In terms of a solution, a few ideas are on the table, essentially. I just want to list some of them and see what you guys think. So one is to treat historical data just like we would treat any answer to any question. An answer is accepted if it's the best available description. So if it's the only data point on that subject, then we sort of take it as automatically accepted unless it contradicts some previous data point. In which case, then we might need to have an expert discussion or something like that. But so one way of doing it would be if it's a new batch of data and we never had any other historical data on that particular episode, then it's just as good as we have. Therefore, it's the best available, and just by definition, it's accepted, if that makes any sense. That's one way of doing that. So acceptance by default, unless it contradicts something previously established, in which case we have to figure out what to do. Another way of doing that is accept by default unless there are objections. So if somebody came up with data and data got published, but there are objections, so still have the scientonomic mechanism open for a while, I suppose, or even for an infinite amount of time. And then if there are objections, then the data will say, no, the data has objections to it, so it's people. And finally, the third way of doing it would be to just treat any data as just a data set, effectively similar to the way they do in many sciences. Right? Here is the data set provided by the result of such and such a study. Take it or leave it, pretty much. So it's neither accepted nor accepted. It just goes into the same database, and then you can have concurrent data points. Of course, the downside of this approach would be that you will never know what's accepted, what's not accepted, the historical data. But that might be a good solution, given that we don't expect that much data to have at this stage. So sort of that will postpone the solution of the problem to some future time and say, okay, let's accept all the data we have and worry about it in the future. So these are just some of the ideas that are there. I wonder what people think about these.
I would feel a little bit weird about, like, if we set the bar so low as to be like, well, our first stab at the historical case is like, well, it's our best one, and by definition, like, I mean, that's a super low bar. And to me, I think especially there's already resistance that Scientonomy is having within the philosophical community, let alone amongst historians. Like, imagine just how embarrassing it would be if we said, like, here's our database. It's filled with just stuff that maybe is right. Like, I mean, that would look really, really bad. So to me, there has to be some measure of quality check. Now, and this goes back to the things we were talking about before, and I think Nikki put it really, really well, that, like, there might be some issues that we can handle internally. There might be other issues that we need to handle externally. I think we also need to be a little bit aware about what we look like when we're asking questions. Like, I mean, imagine sending an email to Daniel Garber and being like, was Descartes French? Like, nobody is going to be like people won't take us seriously if we ask these kinds of questions. So I'm on the side of trying to divvy it up. But yeah, I think to Hackup's point, I would be comfortable. I would want to feel comfortable that there's some sort of independent check. that we have some degree of confidence in, even though obviously, there's going to be some degree of fallibility with any reliability check that we do.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was thinking the same thing. It's like we don't want Sciento Wiki to have the same reputation as Wikipedia, right? Like the idea that we have like a pretty decently solid database with like good data points. Because when I imagine databases, like I feel like at least philosophically wise, like the idea of having a like the Hackup's third option, where it's like you're treating it like it's a data point, take it or leave it, is more similar to like the kind of like philosophy that people have with databases in general. It's like, oh, this is the data we have, like take it or leave it. It's more similar to what I believe like databases do, like what a database should be and what a database is all about. But I'd love to hear other opinions on that as well.
I'm kind of two minds here. I do agree with what Jamie was saying, where I think that we need to have some kind of check. I know that we do have the peer review process, and obviously we find peer reviewers who are able to make sure that we have some level of confidence in the data points that we're giving. But I do want to bring up something that Izzy had mentioned to me before this meeting, in that we could potentially have like some kind of waiting period in between when the paper is published and then when we actually accept it. And during that waiting period, we can do things like reach out to experts and see if anyone has any opinions, leave comments if anyone has any objections to it, like have some kind of time where we're using it as a data point until like a year has elapsed or something like that, at which point if there are no objections and nothing comes back from the reviewers or anyone else as problematic, then we would accept it after that, or something to that effect. Just kind of throwing that as an option. I agree with you. I think that some period of watchful waiting and then maybe more of an auto or rolling kind of acceptance might be good. But anyways, David wanted to speak, and then Paul.
Yeah, I think that something feels like something between what Nikki said and Jacob said. The third option seems what I believe to be the case. I see that Jamie's concern is right. I mean, but I think that he took a more slippery slope view argument that we're gonna ask if Descartes is French. So database is more than that. The third option that Jacob proposed seems to be more than that. But also, when I say that, Nikki also pointed out something very interesting, which is something that between the two options seems to be, in my view, seems to be in the middle way, although I don't have a name yet, is that why we are here. I mean, why Scientonomy community bring, for instance, experts to its inner circle, right? I mean, for instance, I am a Farabandian scholar. I have studied evolutionary biology and AI. So I have good opinions on these three topics in science education. Jamie as well. Jamie is another Farabian expert. So for instance, if one day we will have a topic about Faraband, it will be better to have two experts than one evaluating the paper, for instance, right? And so that's one reason we bring experts to the inner circle of Scientonomy, to have an expert opinion without having to struggle to find one outside, right? So the reason we are here, I mean, this is what I thought when I joined the group, is because my expertise would have some value, right? So what about the cases that where we don't have an expert inside the group? We look outside, okay, but what if it's hard to look? What if people outside don't want to give that time? I think that we just need to keep pushing. And while we don't find, we still want to have a database available. So I think that maybe this is the middle way that I was talking about, between what Nikki proposed, where we have in some cases an internal evaluation, some cases an external evaluation, but also in some situations, the most that we're gonna have, at least for some time, would be the database, and it's better than nothing.
I wonder if Scholarpedia might be a good model for us to follow. In other words, in Scholarpedia, each article has a curating expert. when, at least later on, when we have a database, maybe we need a curating expert for each of the areas that our database deals with that can vouch for the content. But I don't know, again, the labor power, where do we get it? We need to figure out how Scholarpedia does it. How do they get a scholar to act as reviewer for each of their articles? I don't know.
That's a really interesting idea. I think we should talk about it more, but then both Andrews and then Jakob has a comment.
Yeah, I actually don't have any answer to Paul's suggestion, but I wanted to bring up how, in my current interest in psychology, and how they've been dealing with something called the replication crisis, where a lot of the data they find is not replicating. And so what they've been doing, I can send a link in the chat. This is what I quickly got from the APA website. This is one of the things they do, which is called pre-registration. So basically, before they actually submit the paper, they submit something called a pre-registration, where they kind of show, like, here are what I'm going to do for this project. Here are the step-by-step things I do. And it's just to kind of be more open with, this is how I'm going to do my research. And I don't know how exactly this might translate to historical research, but I thought this would be really interesting to just share. This is what scientists are just trying to be more open to. Maybe we can try and incorporate this ourselves. The reason why I brought this up was it reminded me when, I think it was Jakob who said we can accept a data points until they're contradicted. And it's just that big question, when do we know these things are going to be contradicted? And I think it's really important to figure out how we're going to make sure sorry, now I'm confusing things. So two things is, one, we need to figure out, make sure to be transparent in what we're going to do with the data and what we're trying to use for a certain historical case study. And second is, how do we actually verify that? What are the processes?
Just to build off the idea that I know that some people seem to really like the third option. I think that the idea, or at least if we can accept the premise that expert evaluation is also in some form fallible, treating their evaluation as a marker in like a table or a database seems somewhat appropriate. For example, I imagine we can develop some sort of method for noting which evaluators are better than other. For example, if I make a tool that's like ChatGPT something, right? Like at the time of making it, we can imagine that it could be less valuable than a historian that's specialized in the field when evaluating. This is in line with what we're already doing, because we're treating certain evaluators, for example, like specialists, as like the highest form of data appraisal. And I'm sure in some way, shape, or form, actually, I'd like to hear a little bit more before I keep going. But yeah, like I think that treating the data as data seems appropriate to me, but that's my perspective. I'm sure that other people, like historians, might disagree.
Here's what I've been taking extensive notes. So here are a few things I think we all seem to agree. First, I think we all agree with Jamie's worries that we don't want to end up with poor quality data. That's if it's really poor quality, we just don't want to have that kind of stuff. That's obviously not the case. On the other hand, I think we also all agree that we need to have a more streamlined way of accepting historical data, and so that the current mechanism is not really working, even with this handful of the 8 modifications we have. Imagine what's going to happen once these new approaches start to pour a lot of new data into. So there's this. So I think I take these two things to be our starting point. So we don't want bad data, but we also want to make sure that we have some kind of a streamlined way. So how do we do that? I think Nikki's suggestion might be the key here. So there seems to be historical data of two kinds. One, if it's purely, if we are just doing scientonomic translation from the language of historians to scientonomic language, I think I agree that we are probably the best experts to judge how good that translation is. Like nobody else will be a better expert to evaluate whether we did a good job translating. I mean, there's just no way, because nobody will know our language better. And as far as we understand, we know at least some history of science, so we understand that jargon. So when it comes to that, I think we are the experts. When it comes to primary research, so those observational Scientonomy papers that are doing primary research, actually going into the archives, But then, of course, we are not the best experts. So because now we are making claims about the actual history of science, bypassing the historians' situations, we need the expertise of historians. So how do we do this? So currently what we're doing with both types of observational papers, we're trying to find at least one professional historian who is an expert in the field. So we have papers that are doing primary observational research, going into archives. We have secondary papers, secondary research papers that are just translating to the scientific language what historians of science are already saying. And there seem to be two distinct strategies that we can employ here. If it's a primary thing, we have to have at least one reviewer who's an expert in the field, but after the paper is published, we can then treat that data as being verified by the expert in the area. And if it's a secondary scientific research that is just translation research, then even a scientologist should be able to verify that. So in which case, in both cases, published would mean that we already have some kind of a quality check. So I'm curious to hear what.
I agree with, sorry, I just looked straight at my camera. That was weird. I agree with Jakob and Andrew Squared, as well as like Nikki's earlier point. So I think a good idea is to have some kind of a division between internal validation, external validation, and that will help at least limit the amount that we need to kind of go out for external support. If we're finding reviewers for papers, I mean, reviewing a paper is quite a bit. Maybe there's like strategies we can pick up that allow us to maybe give a very short paragraph describing the historical data point, so that we can do that over an email or something like that. Now I can't stop looking at my camera. This is freaking me out. So I agree with that. And this is something, once we have the database, we can kind of visualize or make transparent in kind of the way that Andrew A was suggesting with the pre-registration, right? Like we can be transparent with our protocols and say, look, in this case, it seems to be well established in the secondary literature, and this is what we're basing it on. And in other cases, like, well, we base this on an expert opinion, or in other cases, yeah, whatever. We can come up with like a few categories, and we can kind of label data points with which kind of reliability check they kind of went through. One small point I want to also toss out, just to be considerate of, is in the case of secondary literature, or cases where we're scientonomizing historical data. I agree with Nikki that that's a good like point to where, and Jakob, that's where we're going to be the best experts. One thing we would need to do, though, is make sure that the secondary literature had been, I mean, not obviously not exhausted. That's kind of impossible or unnecessary, but like we would still want an extra round of quality checks to make sure that like the relevant secondary literature was actually consulted, and this indeed does reflect a consensus. So that might require a bit of extra work, but maybe that's the kind of things we're already doing anyways with supervisors, and projects are reading all these papers anyway. So like maybe that's something our internal mechanisms already deal with.
So I just wanted to say I do like the idea that was brought up by Jakob about having some kind of like visual marker on sort of the trustworthiness of a given data point, like based on its review. I think that's a good way to to allow us to progress as a field while still remaining cognizant of the limitations that we have. So sort of a compromise between speed and accuracy, and it makes it easy to know that, okay, maybe once something that hasn't been properly or like fully checked is checked, we know, okay, we need to go back. This is good, this is not as good, but we still have access to these modifications, to these theories, and can work from them, treading cautiously if they haven't been fully verified. But we don't have to just completely halt progress until we find someone to do it. So I think that could be a good compromise. And about what we're getting fact checked, I don't know if we necessarily need to to have them look at the whole paper, we could be very selective of the relevant questions, because let's say we're doing a scientonomic paper on Cartesian physics or something. We don't There are some questions that we would know are the relevant ones to our field, because yeah, sure, we're not experts on Descartes, but we are experts on what we're trying to do with the stuff in the Descartes literature. So I think we are qualified to decide what the relevant questions to ask are, and we could sort of distill it down to a very limited, easy to answer set of questions that we ask these experts, just to, be respectful of everyone's time and get things done quickly.
I really like the idea of like if you treat, I know it's kind of like I know I'm like the one of the only computer people here, but treating people as a function and then saying, oh, if you clean the data before you give it to them, you're going to get a better output. Like, wow, that's beautiful, right? But I think I just wanted to say that I really like Hackup's idea, because it really does align directly with what I was talking about, as in we can have some method of noting which evaluators are better than others. Like, so that we'll have some kind of standard for like maybe if you want like of course like the wording would have to be worked on, but yeah, like Hackup note, like I'm glad he's faster than I am, but I like having a method for knowing, oh, like this data is probably cleaner than this data, and even having it binary is okay with me too. But yeah, no, I just thought that was a beautiful way to go about it. I thought Hackup had a good idea.
I think I don't agree with the idea that we need that we don't need a reviewer in the case where we're dealing with the secondary literature, because if we have some principal figures from that secondary literature vouch for us to say this translation is valid, that would help our credibility a lot. That means getting buy-in from ultimately lots of historians of science, but I guess that's what we need to succeed at this. We need that our translations of secondary sources are vouched for by the people who did the work.
I kind of wonder if there's a way to integrate Cameron's idea with Paul's point. Like in the one case where it's a translation paper, we have any Scientonomer review it, and then we send out that list of specific questions to an expert. And then in the case where it's not a translation paper, we're working with primary sources, we get a historian of science to review it and send out the list of questions to somebody who's even more of an expert if the case study is really specific. So kind of in both cases, we have the historical input, but it's not as taxing as having somebody with it. Like we would still, in most cases, be able to just have a Scientonomer do the review as normal.
I just want to clarify, maybe Hackup can clarify, well, what do we do when we're mixing primary resources and secondary resources? Are we just going to assume since there's at least one primary resource, we still need to verify that with external resources? And my second question is different. I was just wondering, what do existing databases like the database about the classification of biology and like the NASA database, the one Paul described on his talk on, I think it was this Monday, how do those databases verify their own data? Maybe we can learn from them as well.
Yeah, I guess it's a question I have to directly answer. I don't know how they do it in scientific databases. I know how they do it in databases that are roughly in our same ballpark, like DRH and SESHAT. So specifically those two that we have friends working on. In those cases, the mechanisms are not quite the same in both of those. But for every data point, you can check first who entered it and who verified it. So there's a way of, for instance, in their DRH, they have a tier system. So verified by an expert, by sort of a graduate student, or no, I don't remember the exact categorization, but they have that kind of a tiering system. So people have different levels of expertise attached to them. And so if it's verified by a field expert, that's the best data. If it's not, then it's something else. But also we have to keep in mind that their type of data that they're gathering is possible to be gathered by someone with a relatively low level of expertise. In Scientonomy, you would be very hard-pressed to find a situation where you can gather any Scientonomically relevant data unless you really, really know first your Scientonomy and also that time period, because it's not that easy. I'm not saying their data is easy, but for instance, one of the types of data that Seshat gathers is the population in that polity at that particular time period. So you can pretty much do that by reading some history of Greece book or something like that and get it from there, right? So any person who can read history can actually do that, which is not quite the same as gathering scientonomic data, which requires much, much more complex translation into the language of acceptance, pursuit, use, and all sorts of other things. So yeah, but I agree that maybe we should look into how they do in scientific databases.
I think this is kind of building off of what like Jamie said and what Cameron said, and also the problem of like the potential language barrier and historians not understanding like scientonomic language. I feel like my suggestion would be to, especially for people who are researching historical cases using primary sources, I think it would be beneficial to involve historians earlier, maybe even after the paper is like completely finished or polished. I feel like there would be preliminary questions we can pose to them and have them like just greenlight these historical facts for us before our researchers complete the paper. And I agree, like, yes, it would be beneficial to have someone peer review the paper as well. But I think just having some basic facts greenlighted early on, and then maybe reaching out to the same historian afterwards, and then like telling them to like go over the paper again. I think it would just be, I think the whole like communication will be more streamlined and the whole process will be more effective.
I was just going to comment on some previous things that you have been saying. I think that we have no major issue with the secondary sources. I think we have been rigorous with the use of secondary sources. So the issue is when primary source work is really needed, partly in the case of Paul and Dizzy's paper on alchemy. So I agree with Jacob that we can keep the Scientonomy part for Scientonomists to review, because there are no external experts really on Scientonomy, and leave the essential primary source checking to experts like top historians who are very nitpicky with this kind of stuff, so we can actually get them to direct us to the right sources. I think that's what's important. Get them to use the right sources for what we need, rather than expecting them to review whole scientonomic papers. So in this sense, I agree with Cameron. We don't need them to review a whole scientonomic paper, but just like a specific part of it, which is the one relevant for the historical research in question.
Two things. I think that about first source, I think that we will not just benefit, like Stephanie suggests. I think that maybe in most cases it is, or at least as a general rule, should be mandatory to have an expert review in first source. Because we all know that have an expert review in a secondary or primary source would be beneficial for the paper. But the question is, what should we have a rule? Is it mandatory or is it not mandatory? So I think it should be, if it includes a primary source, I think it should be mandatory, especially because of grammar. There are terminological differences, scientific concept meanings that changes across time, and anyways. And also about the incentives to have them to review the paper, or at least part of the paper. Maybe you could send the whole paper and just ask them to focus on the specific part. We just select the part of the paper, but they will have access to the whole paper, because maybe it's strange that you receive just small section of the papers, then must, well, review this. Like, I would be very concerned to review a paper that's just, like, say, blanket as like by the FBI, by the CIA, and just I have access to this small part of the paper. I would give the access to the whole paper and ask them, look, I know that you are a historian expert, and then I'm asking to focus on this one part here, but you have access to the whole paper. But I will not in any case give credit to the reviewer. This is against scientific practice. It brings conflict of interest, because I would agree with the paper that we will include my name on it. I will not reject. Okay, just to be clear, I'm being honest here. I mean, almost 100% of the case, I'll say, okay, let's get my name in one paper that I didn't have the work to do it, but it's good, right? So I think it goes against scientific practice, and also brings conflicts of interest. I think we need to find another way to bring incentives to the reviewers. Yeah, just that.
Thanks for bringing up those points. Those are that's really important to keep in mind. I think Jakob, and then Andrew, and then Nikki, and then Josh.
Thank you, Izzy. Do you mind if I share the screen? Because I put together a little bit of a...
Not at all.
Thank you. Phyllis, so I think it boils down to three questions, what we've been discussing so far. So the first question is, what do we do during research phase to make sure that the data is of a solid quality? And I think we all agreed that we should try to consult experts as often as possible on specific data-related questions. This is sort of things we've been doing already. Izzy and Paul were in touch with Newman, I believe, and so Stephanie, in your project, you also had expert input, right? So that one thing I think we can all do. So then the next question is, what do we do during review phase to make sure that the data is of a solid quality? And here it seems like the idea that we're dealing with two types of papers, following Nikki's suggestion that for translation papers, so that's Scientonomers are the judge of it. Again, if possible, we cannot, if possible, get an expert reviewer as well. But for primary research papers, we can stipulate, as David has said, that it must be mandatory. So it's not just an optional, mandatory to have at least one field expert to review. And then the question that we still have to sort out, is it reviewing at least the data points or the whole paper? I'm not sure about this bit. And then this leaves also the question open as to how should we treat the published data if we follow all of these procedures? Does that mean that once everything is followed here, published equals accepted? Because in those cases, we will also have to make sure if, let's say, there's some conflict with previously published data, that has to be solved during the reviewing process. So if the new data comes in, just like in most sciences, the newer means the better in that case, because it's already been confirmed and verified that, yeah, this data is better than the previously published data. Okay. So yeah, this is, I think, where we currently are in that case. Oh, and then there's, of course, the fourth question, which I forgot to mention. Should we have some sort of an indication as to who, to sort of say, sort of the level of a reviewer, expert reviewer that we had? What if we had some graduate student who we think is extremely talented and expert in a certain period of history? Let's say we asked Izzy to review something on history of classics or something, and then would that have to be indicated? So this was reviewed by graduate student, this was reviewed by faculty, or some such other thing.
I think Hack will cover some of the stuff I wanted to talk about, but one thing that is not on the page that I wanted to note, because I think Stephanie mentioned it once, Cameron mentioned it, well, Cameron mentioned one of the ideas as well. I'll just say it, just noting the idea of like finding a better way to triage for the stuff that we're not able to do. So like, for example, doing a lot of the Scientonomy work we can do in-house, but like trying to better the process of getting historians and whatnot, or like, for example, getting historians early in process that Stephanie noted, or I think it was Cameron that noted, was it the like noting the important parts of paper to make it easier for them, or just to facilitate or butter up the process. Even David noted the importance of that as well, or like, you know, just the process of adding historians into our kind of like workflow / like pipeline process. So I think clarifying that is probably a good point of talking in and of itself, but yeah.
I have a few maybe confusions now. So on point number 3 on the screen, isn't it currently accepted right now that the review process is evaluating for pursuit worthiness, not acceptance? And maybe I'm confused because we're talking about data right now, but the original question we have on our historical, on the page, the agenda, is modifications. Are we taking modifications to be data, or what are we doing here? Because I don't think that we should take historical modifications. We should review historical modifications for acceptance when we're reviewing theoretical modifications for pursuit worthiness. There seems to be a sort of asymmetry there, which doesn't seem to really make sense to me. And then something else, it just seems that there's an assumption, and I think I was guilty of this assumption too, in my previous comment, is that we're seeming to say that Scientonomers aren't historians. And I think maybe that's just like a current thing, and that most people here are philosophers, but like Juan, as we saw, knows everything about astronomy. So Juan is a historian. So this also goes back to David Day's point, I think. So if we had, for instance, a paper, a primary research paper on Feyerabend's belief system, we wouldn't have to go to someone outside the Scientonomy community. We would go to David Day or to Jamie, and that we wouldn't need an external reviewer for that. We just need an expert. So there's a sort of orthogonal thing going on, an internal, external community, and then, you know, an expert or a non-expert on the subject. So, okay, yes, I see the edit going on the screen right now. So yeah, just, so my two main points of confusion, I think, are that, is data the same as modifications right now? Are we talking about historical data and historical modifications is the same thing? And on point 3, is it a review for acceptance or is it for pursuit worthiness?
I think the types of modifications we're talking about are specific historical data points. Anything that has any sort of theoretical flavor to it should still go through the usual mechanism of scientonomic modification. So it was specifically about this type of stuff, data points like this, tables. So any historical claims that agent A at time T took such and such a stance towards element such and such. So that kind of stuff, or pursued something. Does that make sense? So of course, effectively, if we are to approve this sort of a change, then that is going to create two different distinct approaches, one towards theoretical modification, one towards data points. That was the whole motivation for this. Just the current way of evaluating modifications doesn't seem to work for historical modifications. It works pretty well for theoretical because everybody seems to have an opinion. Even if you are a historian who's an expert on some small community, some niche historical time period, you still might have a good idea about what sort of patterns emerge as science changes. So everybody seems to have a good position to evaluate those things insofar as you're either historian or philosopher or whatever. But with historical modification, it's just not the case. Just doesn't seem to be that expertise to have it done in the same way. Does that make sense? So that's why this doesn't seem to be a way to do it all in the same way.
Can I jump in? Sorry.
Yeah, of course.
I couldn't find the raise hand button again. So yeah, okay, so if we want asymmetry, that's one thing, but I still am not sure that we do want that asymmetry, because I do think that, at least if you look at other historical journals, when I think they also evaluate for pursuit worthiness, and you see that in that you have competing histories published in the same history of science journals. And so I think that we should just be peer reviewing for, you know, are you not forging the historical data? Like, is this a good history? Is this good historical data? Not necessarily, oh, do we accept these historical data into our mosaic? And then in that case, we would have, again, these workshop sort of things. And then we wouldn't have to have the expert come in for if we accept the modification of the data or not. At the review stage, we would have it at a separate stage, as we do with theoretical modifications.
I think that yeah, it's pretty clear, right, that as Jacob just said, the way that we're talking about these historical modifications and the way that they're built for input into a database, you know, means it doesn't lend itself at all, right, to this process, this normal scientific process, right, modifications, obviously, that we just said. But I think because this is, you know, data that's sort of meant for a database, you know, we should view it more in that way. I think, you know, what sort of differentiates this part of the Scientonomic project, you know, just from normal, you know, history pursuits in journals, right, is that level of precision, right? And so if we can't actually say, if the paper is arguing or is saying that, you know, theory X was accepted between these two dates and until this time, and we can't actually say that that's what we think, then, you know, I don't see why, you know, it's worth publishing in Scientonomy. That could be worth publishing in some history journal. Is, I guess, my view on it. So from that perspective, I think that that it does make sense we should sort of filter for acceptance, at least on the historical side, like pre-publication, right? So that when it's published, we know that it's accepted, and then that gives us the additional sort of scalability, you know, for this project, or when we have, you know, hopefully dozens of historical, I guess, modifications, we'll call it, although I'm not sure I love the term modifications for this kind of thing. But yeah, then it won't slow down the process as much. I think adding a lot on the back end after publication to make sure it's fit for the database is going to really drag the project back, and it has to be built for scalability, right? Because it's got some lofty ambitions. So that's all. Those were my 2 cents, but also to allay those fears that maybe it's setting the bar too low, and I don't think it is, because, you know, the publication process will be rigorous, as shown in like point 2 there, which I agree with. There could, of course, be, you know, pretty easily the inclusion of, as many people here have suggested, right, this like this marker. There's sort of an extra column, I guess, in the database to show verification of. I'm not sure it's necessary, but it's very easy to add that, and that could help allay fears. So
I agree that we need to separate. I think that Nick had the point that he has a point that needs to separate what the papers that are published means, right? Which is worth pursuitiveness. But in practice, what happens is the paper which should be only worth pursuitiveness, I mean, essentially, actually in practice becomes almost automatically a matter of acceptance, right? So if we don't have the quality of the data before the publication, we will be easily led to a mistake of having accepting a paper, his result, with the bad quality data. In practice, in reality, what happens is this paper is not reviewed by us anymore. The database is not reviewed anymore. The historical case is not reevaluated. We just take the results and decided here if we're going to accept it from the scientific perspective, the results, right? If we accept the proposal that's been made in the paper. So actually in practice, although in theory it's just worth pursuitiveness, in practice it becomes fastly becomes something accepted.
David is right. In many, even theoretical modifications, it has been the case that they became almost automatically accepted. And we will have a discussion of a few of those that, although haven't been strictly speaking accepted through the regular scientific means, but everybody treats them as accepted. Let's say Rowley's law of norm employment is several projects rely on it, or let's say Paul's and Cyrus's understanding of disciplines and delineating theory and things like that. We already have how many papers are taking that as a starting point. And yet with theoreticals, there is always the hope that at one point like this, we will gather together and we evaluate them. And if by that point, everybody already agrees, that's great. And with the historical, with the data related ones, it's not as straightforward. And we need, I think, a different way of doing it.
So right now we're talking about modifications or data or whatever proposed in published observational papers. But in what we're also trying to do separate from this, I think, we're trying to do with this published data is eventually put it in a database, right? But that's not just what's going to be in the database. There's also going to be AI generated data in the database. So I think we need to just keep that in mind, because is there going to be a difference when we put in the database? Like, is this from a published paper or is this from an AI? And what sort of processes should those two different things go through?
Right. So I think that especially in light of a lot of the skepticism towards the use of AI in a lot of fields of academia, especially in the humanities, it might be even more important to have these reviews if we're using an AI populated database, not necessarily because we don't trust the data, but if we want to have closer relations with the broader community, sort of in terms of legitimizing Scientonomy in the general mindset, which I've heard that's one of the goals going on right now. I think having some kind of expert review is especially important if we're using AI to help populate the database, just as an additional, again, legitimization.
So just really quickly to Andrew and Cameron's point, I think it's true that ranking peer reviewers by education can be kind of harsh and maybe not really encapsulate kind of what's really important from a peer reviewer. But I do think that it's also just a good idea to get like bigger names, just to say like this person was here, this person went here, and they peer reviewed this project. And even if we have ChatGPT, again, just as like a legitimization thing, to have those names, I do think is quite important. And I'm not sure if this was explicitly stated, but we were talking about it in the chat, or maybe just having a page on the wiki sort of dedicated to peer reviewers may be a nice way to incentivize peer reviewers without actually putting their names on the paper as an author.
Thank you. So, Phyllis, I don't think we will have a solution to this right away, and that wasn't the plan even to begin with. The hope was just to put these questions out there to see what the community thinks, and maybe gradually build some kind of a course of action. Yeah, even as we saw, there at least seems to be at least 4 distinct questions with several sub-questions. So how should we proceed about this? Are we hoping that we are close enough to some kind of a practical solution that we may try to sit down, let's say tonight, a few of us, and just bring this to some sort of a formulation that could be voted on? Or you guys think we're not close enough, so we probably need a few more sessions to discuss before we are close to that? So what's the general feeling? Because what I think, one thing we can all agree is that we need the coffee break. So we would get sort of.
I think it'd be appropriate to have one session just to measure where we're at. If it's a question already that we're not sure whether we're at a point where we can make some sort of like method to for the review process for certain processes that we want to look at, then I think that it's appropriate to have a session to see, hey, are we close enough to that?
Fair enough, and thanks. And then Jamie?
Yeah, I think we're like at least pretty close on some kind of broad points. Like maybe we don't need to have all of the details figured out. But I think maybe just sharpening something ready for a vote would be good. I mean, there seem to be a couple things. I mean, I'm just feeling the room here, but obviously we'll vote and we'll see how it goes. But it seems like we all agree that there's a distinction between cases that we handle ourselves versus cases that we go to others. We also seem to agree that there's some cases in which we're going to consult experts who might be internal or external. There seem to be a couple points at which we seem to agree, and those might be, once we can kind of like have those sharply formulated, I think we could come to a vote on those. I don't know that we're gonna solve all of the problems, with this aspect of the workflow, maybe all at once or even all within the next couple of days. But I think that, we can at least make enough progress to say like, okay, here's some broad line practice things that we're going to initiate. And we can we'll revisit this question in the future, depending on how it turns out.
So how about we do it this way? I was trying to capture what people were saying, but there's a very great probability that I might have missed half of what was said. If anything didn't make it into that screen that I was sharing, how about you send Izzy and I even specific formulations that maybe this is how it can be done, or here's another way of answering question 2 or 3 or 5 or whatever. Just send those to us. We'll try to formulate as many mutually exclusive solutions, mutually exclusive answers to the same question as possible. Then during the voting, you could say, for instance, this is my first choice, my second choice, something along those lines that we could do, and see where the sentiment is. And if there's an agreement, then everything is great. If there's no agreement, then we can just focus on those. How does that sound? Yeah, so in that case, please send all of these suggestions, and we can just add those, and we'll have to sit down at some point, maybe early tomorrow, and analyze and see which ones are mutually exclusive, and put them offer for voting.
Jakob, I was also thinking, I put it in the chat, maybe we could put everything that we have right now on some sort of page on the wiki, just keyed to like 2024-001, and then people can participate in the discussion tab there as well, in case they forget to or don't want to, for some reason, email us directly.
Great. So shall we have a coffee break and then actually start discussing actual suggested modifications?